Welcome everybody to the workshop of the Barcelona Institute of Analytic Philosophy, BIAP, on factual statements in the legal discourse. 5 years ago, we created this research institute, bringing together groups from the University of Barcelona, Pompeu Fabra University, and the University of Girona in the fields of analytic philosophy of language, analytic philosophy of mind, analytic philosophy of science, and analytic philosophy of law. A year ago, the Spanish Ministry of Science recognized the BIAP as a Maria Maeztu Center of Excellence in Research, with a project focusing on evidential reasoning across the diverse philosophical domains. This workshop is the first one we organize in Girona within the framework of the BIAP project. And I want to express my gratitude, especially to the speakers, for being here. For the Girona Research Group in Philosophy of Law, this is a research project that joins and complements other initiatives, such as Quaestio Facti, International Journal on Evidential Legal Reasoning, which precisely today has published its 6th volume, and the Master Program in Evidential Legal Reasoning. I don't want to spend more time on this introduction, so as not to take away from the presentations and discussions. Therefore, I conclude by reiterating my appreciation. The first presentation will be delivered by Constanza Ihnen. Constanza has a bachelor's degree in literature and linguistics from the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile and a PhD in argumentation theory, rhetoric, and philosophy of language from the University of Amsterdam. Currently, she is a researcher and lecturer at the Institute of Argumentation in the Faculty of Law at the University of Chile. Her main areas of interest include the pragmatic analysis of discourse, legislative argumentation, and constitutional argumentation. Her presentation today has the title, Ways of Criticism, the Inductive Force of an Argument, Some Implication for the Evaluation of Legal Evidence. Thank you so much, Constanza. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jordi, for the presentation. Before I begin, I would like to thank the University of Girona, the University of Barcelona, and the University of Pompeu Fabra for organizing this seminar. I would also like to thank Professor Jordi and also Diego for inviting me to present at this seminar. I can't think of a better place to put my ideas under scrutiny. For at least 2 years, I have been fascinated with the question as to whether we can assess argumentative force and how we might be able to do so. What I will present now is my latest attempt to provide an answer to this question. Being sincere with you, I do not think I have succeeded, but I would like to think I'm getting closer. I'm certainly not the first one to be fascinated by this question. In fact, my research builds on the concept of inductive force as developed by Jonathan Cohen, particularly his methodology for assigning force to arguments and hypotheses. I assume you're all familiar with his approach, so I will only mention 4 ideas underlying Cohen's proposal, which are also my theoretical starting points. First, the strength of a hypothesis is equivalent to the argumentative force of the reasoning that justifies it. Second, the force of an inductive argument is the function of its capacity to overcome an eliminative procedure. Third, the eliminative procedure tests the applicability of the divisible generalization underlying the argument in its context of use. And finally, 4, the more numerous and varied the tests an argument is capable of overriding, the greater the strength of the argument and of the hypothesis it justifies. So I believe I start from there, right? I believe that Cohen's methodology is a powerful instrument for assigning force to arguments and criticisms, but I also think that it ought to be complemented with a fine-grained distinction of type of criticisms that can be issued against an argument, the inductive force of an argument. And so this paper basically, or in this presentation, I want to present a typology of those criticisms and then explain what kind of effects it can have in the force of the argument, but also force of the criticism, right? Like how do they compare to each other? I will start with some definitions. The concepts I will present now are all very familiar to you, so the reason why I'm defining them is because they can be taken with different meanings, right? And so I just want to make sure that we all understand the same thing by these concepts, at least in the context of this presentation. So I will define argumentation as a speech act. That's my pragmatic perspective on this. I will define argumentation as a speech act, the illocutionary point of which is to justify a standpoint or conclusion by means of a constellation of statements. I will take it as a given that argumentation can be deductive or inductive, and by inductive I mean I subsume every kind of divisible argument. Right? We could make more fine distinctions later, but for the time being, it's enough for me to say that I have deductive and divisible arguments. Okay? An argument will be deductive, if the inference rule on which it is based uses a non-divisible generalization of the form if P then Q, a material implication or some equivalent. And instead, an argumentation will be inductive if its inference rule uses a divisible generalization of the form, normally if P then Q. We could formulate this in different ways, but basically normally is one way of showing that it's a divisible divisible rule. Moreover, I will understand that an argumentation can be simple or complex. This is very important for my paper because from now on I will be talking about simple arguments. An argumentation is simple when it provides a single reason to justify a conclusion. And I will understand following two mean that a very basic argument contains, so a simple argument contains a claim, a data, and a warrant. But you also have complex argumentation, and then you have basically a set of simple arguments justifying one's same standpoint. Finally, I will further assume that to assess the overall force of complex argumentation, one first has to determine the argumentative force of each simple argumentation. All the definitions I will propose, as I said before, are centered in simple arguments. So I turn to the second definition, argumentative force. I will define the argumentative force of a simple argumentation as the degree to which the acceptability of the premises of a relevant argument is transferred to the conclusion. I will understand the degree of transference from premise to conclusion as a function of the degree to which the generalization underlying the argument is applicable in a given context. Now, two things about this definition, so this definition of argumentative force. The first is that with this definition, I'm basically saying that when you judge or evaluate the force of an argument, you first need to establish that the premises are acceptable and the argument is relevant. Only once you have done that, then you can go to the next step, which is to establish the force of the argument. We can discuss this later, but basically this is a decision, right? Because I could have included acceptability in measuring the force of the argument. I can justify it later, okay? But for the time being, just know that acceptability and relevance are outside the scope of the concept of force I'm using. The second point, to observe about this definition is that it is broad enough to apply both to inductive and deductive argumentation. So deductive argumentation will have only one level of force, maximum argumentative force. And another way of putting this is that deductive maximum force is context independent. If the argument is deductive, then it has maximum argumentative force. Inductive argumentation can have no argumentative force, some degree of intermediate argumentative force or maximum argumentative force, but in contrast to deductive force, inductive force is context dependent. This means that if I have an inductive argument with maximum argumentative force, it can be maximum in that context, but it could not be in another. Yeah? This is the sense of context dependency that I'm using. The third definition, all this is in the first page of your handout. I will understand the inductive force of a simple argument as the degree to which the divisible generalization underlying the argument is applicable in a specific context. And I will consider that a simple argument has maximum inductive force if and only if no criticism has been advanced against it in a given context. This would be different in case it were a complex argumentation, obviously, because I would have, like, the argument would have to deal with all the other criticisms that have been leveled, and therefore the argument of the protagonist will become a complex argument which responds to the criticism. So for the time being, I'm taking a picture of a moment in a dialogue, which is when a party has presented an argument and a party has presented a criticism, right? And so the argument will have maximum argumentative force, inductive, if there's no criticism that has been leveled against the argument. Yeah? Finally, and here this is the core of my presentation, right? Criticisms to the inductive force of an argument. I will understand a criticism as a type of speech act, the illocutionary point of which is to present a constellation of statements as a justification for a conclusion, statements by which it is implicitly or explicitly asserted that, first, certain relevant variable is absent, or it is unclear whether certain relevant variable is absent or present in the context at hand, and, second, this creates some kind of obstacle for the application of the generalization underlying the divisible argument under attack. Note that just as the speech of argumentation, we might have criticisms that are deductive and criticisms that are inductive, and we may also have simple criticisms and complex criticism. So now I turn now to page 2, and I start with these definitions. I will start proposing the typology. So this typology is based in 2 criteria. The first criterion is the subtype of illocutionary points that the speech act of criticizing may have in practice. I'm saying criticizing, but basically I want to mean criticizing the inductive force of an argument. But just for short, I will talk about criticizing. So this is the first criterion, the subtype of illocutionary point of a criticism. Second criterion, the type of propositional content that can be used in the performance of the speech act. So I will refer now to each criterion. The first criterion, right, was the subtype of illocutionary points, and here one may be able to distinguish 3 subtypes of illocutionary points, and therefore 3 subtypes of criticisms to the inductive force of an argument. These are not new categories. These are taken from the literature on divisible argumentation, for instance, Pollock, Bader, Morrow, Pinto, etc. This is not mine, it's more a systematization. So what's an undercutter? According to this literature, an undercutter is a criticism whereby the antagonist attempts to justify the conclusion that the argument under attack does not justify the conclusion that it purports to justify. Then you have rebuttals, or refutations, if you want, whereby the antagonist attempts to justify the opposite conclusion of the argument. And finally, you have diminishers, which are not as well known as the other 2, but it's something that Pollock developed in his latest articles, whereby the antagonist attempts to justify the conclusion that the inductive force of the argument, and thereby the degree of acceptability of the conclusion, is weaker than claimed by the protagonist of the argument before the antagonist presented her criticism. So I will now provide an example for each category. Examples are in the last page of your handout, all of them. So I will start with example 1. Example 1 is the argument under attack in all cases. Yeah? So suppose the protagonist has presented the following argument. Mary shot Susan, this is the claim. Data, eyewitness W1 saw from her window that Mary shot Susan. Warrant, normally, if someone sees something, then that something happened. So how could you possibly criticize this argument? Then you have the 3 types, right? So first you have the undercutter, example 2. The claim in this case is, we cannot conclude that Mary shot Susan. The data is, eyewitness W1, who saw the crime from her window, has high myopia. And warrant, normally, if an eyewitness has high myopia, then we cannot conclude that what the eyewitness saw from her window actually occurred. Then you have a rebuttal. A rebuttal, remember, is when you justify the opposite conclusion, right, from the argument being attacked. So in this case would be claim, Mary did not shoot Susan. Data, eyewitness W2 saw that Mark, not Mary, shot Susan. And then the warrant, normally, if someone sees something, then that something happened. And finally, you have a diminisher. So note that the standpoint or the conclusion is completely different in this case. Is that Mary shot Susan is justified in a lesser degree than the prosecutor suggests. And then data, eyewitness W1, who saw the crime from her window, has visual acuity of 2010. Warrant, normally, if an eyewitness's visual acuity is close to but lower than normal visual acuity, she may not have been able to see clearly what actually happened. So these are just the examples, and it's important to have them in mind because then I can explain better what comes next. So we just saw the subtypes of illusionary points. This is the first criterion for the typology, and the second criterion has to do with the propositional content that are used by each of these speech acts. For the speech act of criticizing the inductive force of an argument to be felicitous, the propositional content must refer to those types of circumstances which, in the context of use, are relevant to test the applicability of the generalization underlying it. Here I basically follow Cohen, right? I should refer to those types of circumstances in terms of relevant covariables. And I will distinguish 2 types of covariables. First, contributed covariables, which is basically the variables, the relevant variables that Cohen addresses or uses in his famous book, The Probable and the Provable, and necessary covariables. So contributed covariables are those circumstance types presupposed by the use of the word normally in the antecedent of a divisible generalization of the form normally, if P, then Q. So schematically, I put it there, right? You have the generalization, normally if P, then Q, and then a covariable, a contributed covariable will be an additional R, right, as another proposition that is conjuncted with P, which is the argument. Unnecessary covariables and not unnecessary, and necessary covariables are circumstance types semantically entailed by the conclusion Q in the divisible generalization, normally if P then Q. And schematically you have in the handout as well as a parenthesis, right, where I'm just conjuncting the entailment. Yeah. I'm almost finishing with this to go to a typology. Be patient. So it requires a lot of preparation. Now observe the predicate used in a covariable. So a covariable is a proposition that contains some kind of predicate, right? So the predicate used in a covariable, contributive or necessary, can be in turn classified in terms of a gradable or non-gradable predicate. A non-gradable predicate attributes a property or relation that is absolute and cannot be measured or compared. For example, dead. Perhaps more something that could be more discussed, but also perfect, although we have in Spanish at least this almost perfect. But it's a bit of a stretch of words, right? Like perfect is supposed to be like an absolute category. Gradable predicates are attribute a property or relation that can be measured or at least compared. For example, see clearly as an eyewitness, being at an appropriate distance to shoot someone. So clearly and appropriate distance are gradable predicates. Regarding these gradable predicates, Klein, but not only Klein, proposed to analyze them as a semantic category with 3 types of extension. So you have the positive extension of a gradable predicate, which is the set of things in a universe of discourse of which it is definitely true in a given context. The negative extension is a set of things of which it is definitely false in a given context. And the extension gap is the set of things that fail to belong either to its positive or negative extension. Now, Klein considered that these gradable predicates are fuzzy sets with a gradable transition. So these are the criteria to base the typology on, and here comes finally the typology. So if you go to your handout, page number 2, there's a table. The first 4 columns summarize the typology. Later on, I will refer to the final column. Okay, the typology is the first 4 columns. So, as you can see, the typology is created by means of the illocutionary force and the propositional content, and next to it is an example. So, undercutters, this is just to refresh your memory. The illocutionary force is to justify the conclusion that the argument does not justify the conclusion that it purports to justify. Sorry, it's almost like a trabalengua. Now, what about the propositional content? And this is, so now we need to bring together both criteria. What an undercutter does is to negate the contributive covariable of the divisible generalization of the argument attacked. And they may do so by either denying that the actual circumstances satisfy the non-gradable predicate of the covariable used, or assert that the actual circumstances fall under the negative extension of a gradable predicate of the covariable used. So just to explain how this works, I'm going to use one example. I won't go through all the examples because I would take too much time. But basically, if you go again to example 2, this is an undercut, right? The generalization under attack is the one in example 1, which is normally if someone sees something, then that something happened. The relevant covariable used by example 2 is the eyewitness who saw something was able to see clearly. This is my R, right? The covariable that I need to show if I am criticizing that is part, well, if it's gradable, and it's gradable, that is part of the negative extension of the predicate of the covariable. So, the argument, eyewitness W1, who saw the crime from her window, has high myopia, negates this contributive variable, right? Like contributive variable of seeing clearly. In this case, it does so by asserting that the actual circumstances fall under the negative extension of the gradable predicate seeing clearly. Now, rebuttals. Rebuttals, I said, the illocutionary point is to justify the opposite conclusion of the argument, but now, thanks to this distinction of covariables, we can distinguish between rebutters that are divisible and rebutters that are deductive. So, what rebutters do is to negate a contributive covariable. But the difference is that in the case of divisible rebutter, what is negated is or denied is the contributive covariable, while in the case of deductive rebutters is the necessary covariable. So example 3 is an example of a divisible rebutter. I will skip that because of time considerations, but I will I want to discuss with you example 5, which is an example of a deductive rebuttal, I think. So, the claim is Mary did not shoot Susan, because it's a rebuttal. And now the data is, at the time the murderer shot Susan with a short-range gun, Mary was miles away from Susan. For example, this would be a subordinate argument, but it's just to give some context, right? For example, she was at the cinema and Mary was shot at her apartment. And then you have the warrant, which is if a person shoots someone with a certain type of gun, then she was at an appropriate distance to be able to carry out the shooting with that type of gun. So in example 5, the antagonist negates a semantic entailment of the conclusion of example 1. The conclusion of example 1 is Mary shot Susan. No? A semantic entailment of that is that Mary was at an appropriate distance to be able to shoot Susan. And the rebutter, what does, is to negate this necessary covariable by arguing that at the time the murderer shot Susan with a short-range gun, Mary was miles away from Susan. So basically placing the circumstances under the negative extension of a gradable predicate, which in this case is being at an appropriate distance. And note that by negating the necessary covariable entailed by the conclusion, the rebutter uses a modus tollens, right? So it uses like Q implies R, not R, therefore not Q. Diminishers. So remember that what diminishers do is to justify the conclusion that the inductive force of the argument is weaker than claimed by the protagonist, right, at the time she put forward the criticism, before she put forward the criticism. And then how is the propositional content of this particular speech check, which are diminishers? I think that they do not deny the satisfaction of a relevant covariable, but they assert the actual circumstances fall under the extension gap of the gradable predicate of the covariable used. The covariable used by a diminisher may be a contributive or necessary variable, as long as it contains a gradable predicate. So I will skip example 4. I can see. I will skip example 4, but example 4 basically is a diminisher using a contributive covariable. I will now show or discuss example 6, which is a diminisher but using a necessary condition covariable. So, example 6. Again, the standpoint or claim is that Mary shot Susan is justified in a lesser degree than the prosecutor suggests. Now the argument is, at the time the murderer shot Susan with a short-range gun, Mary and Susan were in their respective living rooms with the windows of their living rooms 48 meters away from each other. And then the warrant, probably someone knows more about guns than myself, so maybe this is wrong, but this is what I Googled. Normally, if the distance between the accused and the victim of the shooting is close, but outside of the shooting range of the type of gun used, then the accused may have not been able to shoot the victim. So in this case, the relevant covariable used by the diminisher is a semantic entailment of the conclusion that Mary shot Susan, namely, Mary was at an appropriate distance to be able to shoot Susan. The predicate, being at an appropriate distance to shoot, is a gradable predicate. Normally, short-range guns can fire within a range of 45 meters, so says Google, if the user is an expert. Thus, it is unclear whether the 48-meter distance between apartments would be an appropriate distance for Mary to have shot Susan with a short-range gun. So in certain contexts, 48 meters away may be just the kind of circumstances of which we cannot tell whether the distance was definitely appropriate nor definitely inappropriate. So with this, I finished the rules. So how do we use this typology to assign forces to arguments and criticism? So here is a proposal. Some things are taken from Pollack, some other things that occur to me. I'm going to mix them all up. So assuming that the argument attacked and the criticisms presented are simple, and taking for granted further that they all have relevant and acceptable premises, I propose to distribute scores according to the following rules. 1. An inductive argument confronted with an undercutter has no force, while the undercutter has maximum force. The reason for this is that a protagonist of the argument has not offered yet a response to the criticism of the antagonist, while the undercutter has not confronted yet any criticism. If we continue in the dialogue, this will vary, obviously, but this is just a picture of the moment. Second, when an inductive argument is attacked by means of a divisible rebuttal, both argument and inductive criticisms have the same force and cancel each other. This is what Pollock called collective defeat. As a result, both should be assigned no force. The reason for this is that the argument has been attacked by an inductive criticism which the protagonist has not addressed yet. But at the same time, the inductive criticism is attacked by the protagonist argument and the antagonist has not provided a response yet. 3. An inductive argument confronted with a deductive rebuttal has no force, while the deductive rebuttal has deductive force and therefore maximum argumentative force. This rule for the distribution of scores is justified by the fact that an inductive simple argument confronted with a criticism cannot have maximum inductive force, while a deductive criticism can only have maximum force. Now you understand why I spend so much time defining these terms, right? This happens even if it's confronted with an argument that attacks it, right? So it keeps its force because it's context independent. Finally, an inductive argument confronted with a diminisher has some force, but not maximum force. On the other hand, the diminisher, being an inductive argument, has maximum force because it hasn't confronted any criticism yet. But note that the conclusion, so if the diminisher is right, if the diminisher has more force than the argument, then all we can conclude from the diminisher is that the hypothesis has less force, right? So it's not the opposite standpoint, it's not saying that we cannot conclude that, but rather that the conclusion of the argument has less force as presented by the protagonist originally. Now, grading the force of the argument after the diminisher, or even before, might be impossible in certain contexts. However, we do know one thing, that it attenuates, so if the diminisher is okay, it attenuates the force of the argument to some degree. This much I can tell. Yeah, to conclude. So if this topology and the rules for scorekeeping proposed are correct, we may formulate the following implications for the evaluation of legal evidence. First, there are at least 4 ways in which the parties to a legal case can attack the inductive force of a divisible argument justifying a factual statement. If the criticisms are acceptable and relevant, the scores to be assigned to the argument attack and the criticism leveled are different in each case. And this, I would say, is what is different from Cohen's methodology. Yeah? Second, the judge cannot decide whether the argument is sufficient or insufficient. Oh, no, sorry, again. Second, the decision of the judge to establish in a given context whether the argument presented in favor of a hypothesis is sufficient, ahora sí, can take one of 2 forms. First, the judge can establish whether the argument is sufficient or insufficient solely on the basis of the scores assigned to an argument and the corresponding criticism. This is the case when undercutters and deductive rebutters are involved. The judge cannot decide whether the argument is sufficient or insufficient solely on the basis of the scores assigned to an argument and the corresponding criticism, and this is the case when divisible rebutters, since both arguments cancel each other force, and also when diminishers, because the force of the argument is attenuated but not cancelled, are involved. So in these cases, a decision must be taken by the judge on the basis of additional considerations that do not have to do with the force of the argument. So the typology I have presented here assumes a very unlikely scenario, one in which protagonist and antagonist have presented only one argument and only one criticism. Now, the force assigned to each argumentative move will vary significantly as the protagonist and the antagonist develop new arguments to confront their mutual criticisms. So just an example, a criticism which originally is a diminisher, if combined with other diminishers, may end up being an undercutter, right? But that implies analyzing complex argumentation, not simple argumentation. So despite this, I believe these complexities can be dealt with properly once we have a clear understanding of the ways in which argumentative forces can be distributed among single arguments and criticisms. So the typology I have outlined here is only a starting point for a much more complex and nuanced and difficult scorekeeping methodology yet to be developed. That's it.